In recent weeks, I found myself gravitating towards music that makes me nostalgic for my high school years. Whether due to two of my best friends of almost 10 years taking jobs across the country in Austin, Texas, and Washington, D.C. to make more money than I could ever possibly fathom, splintering my high school friend group even more than our divergent college paths already had, or just the inability to acknowledge that my college graduation and 22nd birthday have both passed me by at record speed without my noticing, I've been exploring some of the bands I missed out on in my younger years. I came to what's colloquially known as scene music late in my development, spending my freshman and sophomore years mired in the grunge and alternative of the 90s. Songs like How's It Going to Be by Third Eye Blind and Freshman by the Verve Pipe soundtrack my first heartbreaks, while the seething tones of Nirvana and Soundgarden paired perfectly with my adolescent angst at my father for the concept of mapping out my life at age 16. It was through my two friends who will be departing us soon that I discovered acts like A Day to Remember, My Chemical Romance, and Fall Out Boy, all of whom I quickly fell in love with. Coming late to the party resulted in my missing a lot of the smaller, niche bands of that early Warped Tour era, a mistake I've been working to correct. It's in that quest that I've noticed a bit of a concerning trend. For example, Taking Back Sunday has recently been climbing the ranks of my favorite bands of all time after a recent deep dive through their discography. A fixture of the early 2000s emo circuit, the Long Island-based act exploded onto the scene with their debut record Tell All Your Friends, with singles like Cute Without the E and You're So Last Summer receiving heavy rotation on MTV. Their potent mix of melodic choruses with aggressive instrumentation born from the marrying of guitarist Eddie Reyes' hardcore roots with the more in vogue emo tones, coupled with the trademark vocal trade-off between singers Adam Lazzara and John Nolan, and the consistently excellent drumming of Mark O'Connell, all combine to create a classic record whose deep cuts hold up as well. Bangers like Bike Scene, You Know How I Do, and Great Romances of the 20th Century are all essential listening that would go on to influence countless imitators in the years to come, myself included. They feel timeless in many ways, except for one particular aspect. Time and time again, I find myself recoiling at certain lyrics for their mean-spirited attitude towards the subject of their affection or ire. Lines like, paint a portrait of a gaslighting boyfriend trying to keep his partner under his thumb through deception, lies, and coercion. It fits the textbook definition of what Twitter or TikTok would call male manipulator music. Characterized by misogynistic attitudes, gaslighting, exaggerated emotional outbursts, and overwrought storytelling, male manipulator music isn't so much a genre, rather a style of writing that appeals to the lowest common denominator of the adolescent psyche. The mainstream explosion of male manipulator music, referred to from here on out as M-Cubed, came with the breakout of emo and pop punk in the late 90s and early 2000s. Some would cry out, saying that grunge really began the momentum here. My argument is, while grunge did possess the narcissism and gaslighting that much of what came after it did, it lacks the focus on interpersonal relationships. Acts like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden all avoided focusing on low-level relationship and girl drama for the most part, in favor of topics ranging from political disaffection, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, etc. This is true as well of the goth and new wave acts of the decade prior. Bands like The Smiths, The Cure, and Joy Division are also tagged with this label while not quite fitting the criteria that I've set forth. The underground kids that grew up on these acts, however, would take those themes and atmospheres and apply them to more adolescent issues, almost always girls, relationships, and familial connections. The first wave of bands featured acts like Weezer. Fronted by the sometimes erratic and often creepy Rivers Cuomo, Weezer first caught national attention with their breakout record The Blue Album, which spawned smash hits Say It Ain't So, Buddy Holly, and The Sweater Song. The latter is the first glimpse we get at Cuomo's penchant for voyeurism. Nothing over the top, but still warrants some side-eye glances from those paying attention. It's not overtly creepy if explained away as metaphor, perhaps to represent the way he has been emotionally laid bare by their conversation, rather than taken literally. Cuomo has said publicly that the unraveling of the song's titular sweater is a reference to a concept he heard in a psych class, referencing an old Einstein quote. So fine, fair enough. A layman's reading says one thing, the truth is another. No, it's 1996's follow-up, Pinkerton, where Cuomo's darker side really rears its ugly head. A window into the psyche of a troubled individual who blames his flaws on others and uses them to numb the voices in his own head. Pinkerton in many ways is the antithesis of the Blue Album. The upbeat, chipper vibes of the latter are replaced with these increasingly anxiety-twinged screeds about Cuomo's horrific luck and skill when it comes to the art of courtship and relationships, his struggles with anxiety and depression despite his increasing fame and success, at least partially caused by an intensive surgery he had on his left leg prior to the recording process of Pinkerton. Across the Sea is the most representative and damning example. Written about a fan letter Cuomo received from an 18-year-old Japanese girl, he proceeds to ramble through the 4.5-minute runtime, disgustingly pondering how she dresses and the ways in which she pleasures herself, and pining over the fact that he'll never be able to touch her. The song's chorus, quote, "I need help and you're all the way across the sea," is a phenomenal example of M-cubed philosophy. Taking a situation neither party can control and subtly placing the blame on the less powerful party is a hallmark of this kind of thinking. Cuomo is a man who in this dynamic holds all the cards. An older man who fronts a wildly successful band, who has women throwing themselves at him at every turn, as referenced earlier on the album with Tired of Sex, to take a fan letter, a pretty innocuous one at that if the first verse is to be believed, and manipulate it into a leering, voyeuristic power fantasy about the sender is truly creepy and concerning behavior, made all the more terrible by the fact that the young girl knows the song is about her. In an interview after its release, Cuomo admits to taking lines directly from the letter to use in the song, and that the girl actually collects songwriting royalties as a result. In 2002, Weezer made a point to include the song on the setlist for their tour of Japan, incentivizing die-hard Weezer fans with the knowledge that reaching out to and lusting after Rivers was not only okay, but would actually result in his reciprocating the sexual desires, which is a horrifically dangerous precedent to set, particularly when Cuomo admits in a later interview that he has no idea how old the girl is, quipping when asked if he'd ever met her, quote, "Even if I did see her, she was probably some 14-year-old girl who didn't speak English," end quote. Publicly admitting that your Peeping Tom fantasy track could be inspired by a child is certainly a choice. El Scorcho is a more toned-down version of manipulation, designed for the subject of his affection to pity his pathetic attempts at courtship, a style that would become ever more popular in the years to follow. Prior to Pinkerton's release, it seems that Cuomo sensed that he was crossing some previously set lines of decency on his new record. Writing to a fan club, he said, quote, "There are some lyrics on their album that you might think are mean or sexist. I will feel genuinely bad if anybody feels hurt by my lyrics, but I really wanted these songs to be an exploration of my dark side, all the parts of myself that I was either afraid or embarrassed to think about before. There's some pretty nasty stuff on there," he wrote. Pinkerton was initially a commercial disappointment. The sharp change in tone towards the darker end of the spectrum was off-putting to many fans who had jumped on the bandwagon from their mainstream hits. The singles tanked, and the sales figures took a long walk off a short pier in relation to those of their debut. The masses who flocked to sugary pop hits like Buddy Holly weren't drawn to the Rivers Cuomo cult of personality. Nobody was aching to hear the inner monologue of the doofy guy with glasses dancing around in a sweater vest. Or so everybody thought. It was only with time and context that it grew a loyal fan base, right around the time that the biggest explosion of M-cubed would take place, around the early 2000s. By then the seas had changed dramatically. A generation of kids who had grown up idolizing what they saw as the raw, confessional storytelling of Pinkerton, revering it as an island of honesty and vulnerability in a sea of nondescript, airy navel-gazing from contemporary acts like Semisonic, Oasis, and Blur. Those kids would grow up to form acts like Dashboard Confessional, Good Charlotte, and Taking Back Sunday, all of whom cite Pinkerton as massive influence on their writing. In that way, it's fair to say that Weezer and Rivers Cuomo are the progenitors of the modern iteration of M-cubed. Their DNA is streaked across the modern alternative landscape. Their brand of teenage and young adult manipulation would be copied 1,000 times in the years to come by a range of acts, both in the nascent emo category, but also transcending traditional genre bounds as well. Let's get back to where we started this conversation, with Taking Back Sunday. Now with the added context of the way their style and lyricism were influenced by the original M-cubed act, let's take a deeper dive into the ways in which Adam Lazzara, John Nolan, and later Fred Mascherino would interpret and develop the new century style of M-cubed. Breakout hit Cute Without the E is a straightforward, bitter breakup song making use of the kind of violent fantasies that were popular amongst this set of emo kids, most notably found in the work of contemporaries like The Used and early My Chemical Romance. The second verse is where our analysis begins.
Trying to explain it, I know exactly what goes on when you're yours. I'm outside of your window. I'm outside of your window. What did I give all the details covered? You sweet.
Typical gaslighting boyfriend behavior, really. Blaming the girl's actions on her period, belittling her for being easily taken in by smooth-talking men, and stalking her while she's with her new boyfriend all add up to the textbook definition of what we're looking for here. It doesn't get much better on Your So Last Summer, which veers more so into the territory of overdramatics as a means to draw sympathy, exemplified by the second verse, which reads,
I would never lie to you, definitely you. Less I had to, I'll do what I got to. Less I had to, I'll do what I got to. The truth is you could slip on the road without one last gasping breath. I apologize for being on your tears.
It's hysterics with the intent that the cheap shock value keeps his partner around. When that doesn't work and she chooses to leave anyway, he resorts to bitterness, culminating in the famous outro that sees Lazara shout, At this stage, I think it's important to note the ways in which I feel like Taking Back Sunday have separated themselves from Weezer's original implementation of this trope. Lazara and Nolan don't share Cuomo's penchant for voyeurism and leering, outside of one questionably relevant lyric at the end of Great Romances of the 20th Century. They also present themselves not as guys who are incapable of getting girls, far from it in fact. Rather, they've co-opted the trappings of gaslighting and manipulation to make themselves appear cooler, more desirable, the exact opposite of the confessional, honest creepiness that Cuomo was exploring on Pinkerton. It also all reads as an act, much in the way that nobody saw used singer Burt McCracken as a violent, dangerous figure despite his often disturbing lyrics. I don't believe it should be implied that the lyrics on offer here are anything more than artifice, exploring a fantasy version of reality that elevates the narrator to what he believes is a cooler state of being. As their career continued, Lazara has made a conscious effort to distance himself from some of the lyrics we've discussed here. He changes a line on Cute Without the E from, quote, "Now all of this is all your fault," to, quote, "Now all of this is all my fault," when performing the track live, and on their acoustic album from 2009, the line, quote, "Don't bother trying to explain, Angel, I know exactly what goes on when you're on," the last three words are omitted, dropping that particular nasty meaning from the track. The departure of John Nolan after 2003's Tell All Your Friends held potential to reshape the way that Taking Back Sunday approached their songwriting and lyrics, with new hire Fred Mascherino bringing a fresh voice and perspective to the group. But the opposite happened. Where You Want to Be and Louder Now, the group's most commercially successful material, with singles like Decade Under the Influence from the former and Make Damn Sure from the latter receiving mainstream attention, features some of the most glaring and jarring examples of manipulation and gaslighting lyrics in their entire catalog, sprinkled more liberally across these projects than Tell All Your Friends was. 180 by Summer, my favorite Taking Back Sunday song, opens with the lines,
Go on to say it. You need me like a bad habit. One that needs you to be still be dead and low. Go on to say it. All you said, you need me like.
Overlapped in the traditional Taking Back Sunday style, these two lines veer dangerously close to abusive relationship territory. Admitting you want your partner's defenses down, isolating them to be dependent on you and away from family and friends is a telltale sign of abusive, gaslighting partners. That trend continues on Spin, the heavy post-hardcore banger from Louder Now, which features Lazara's most controversial lyrics to date.
The unfortunate that you had and that you politically dead and made it all that much easier to lie. But it's nothing that I'm proud of. No, it's nothing that I'm proud of. Making an example out of you. This is face. This is a creep. This is face.
It's a continuation of the themes we looked at with 180 by Summer, but taken to another level, reframing the actions of the narrator, which on the previous track took the form of a need, into basically something he's doing for his own amusement, or perhaps as a form of punishment to the victim. Quote, "I'm making an example out of you," reads as particularly malicious. It's the one lyric in their whole discography where I legitimately question Lazara's intent. When earlier examples read like artifice created to elevate the narrator's sense of coolness, this line feels like it's coming from a much darker and more sincere place. Some analysis I've read of the track summarizes that the abortion being referenced is being used as a metaphor for some other kind of traumatic event. One, I don't buy it. It's far too specific a phrase to apply to something else. And two, even if that is true, it's bad writing and sends a horrible message. Reckoning with this as a listener is hard for me. While I recognize the negative aspect of the writing, I find it difficult to discern where my own morality draws the line between confession taking the form of performance and truly negative behavior. I mentioned earlier the way in which I feel Rivers Cuomo was abusing his platform with the lyrics from Across the Sea. If I'm being totally honest, I don't know that I would put Lazar's lyrics in the same category. I don't see a situation in which someone listens to 180 by Summer or Spin and takes out of it advice for how to behave in relationships. Rather, I think it serves as catharsis. A violent, repulsive outlet for negative feelings that exist inside all of us that's easy to miss if you get lost in the melody or the crush of the guitars and drums. The next few years were tumultuous for Taking Back Sunday. Multiple lineup changes and a middling album in 2009 in the form of New Again, which saw the departure of Fred Mascherino under unpleasant circumstances, gave way to a reunion of the original Tell All Your Friends lineup for a self-titled record at the turn of the decade. That period saw a huge shift in Lazar and Nolan's writing, with the two lyricists looking inward and reflecting on their negative behavior and tendencies and choosing to take accountability for it rather than pass the blame onto other people. It was a dramatic maturation process, and one that remained constant, regardless of the quality of later albums like Happinesses and Tidal Wave. Let's quickly look at Better Homes and Gardens from the former, a song exploring Lazar's separation from his fiancée or wife.
The courage that must took, I just could not believe it. The moment you were, made all that bullshit seem worth it.
When in years past, Lazar would approach a situation like this with an over-the-top, bitter, and potentially violent reaction, now, later in life and career, he writes from a detached perspective, showing his ability to analyze both sides of the situation rather than just lash out from a perceived slight against his position. I highlight this to say that I believe this shows that Lazar and Nolan don't have to rely on M-cubed tropes to write compelling music, and to tell engaging stories, as I argue this track in particular is some of their best storytelling. Taking Back Sunday and their contemporaries are now nearing their 25th anniversaries, meaning that, just like Weezer before them, they've spawned a series of disciples drawing upon those themes to express their adolescent angst in song. The 2010s saw the rise of the so-called emo revival, a collection of bands who wore these influences on their sleeves and who saw themselves as a natural counter to several years of uptempo easycore and pop-punk dominating the Warped Tour scene in the late aughts. Headlined by acts like Joyce Manor, The Hotel Year, and The World is a Beautiful Place and I Am No Longer Afraid to Die, the emo revival by and large forewent the M-cubed trappings of their 2000s counterparts, preferring to return to something approximating the grunge approach, focusing more on generalized malaise, depression, anxiety, drug and alcohol abuse, as well as political topics. There were a few acts, however, who are carrying the M-cubed torch into a new decade. That list, for me at least, does not feature Mom Jeans, one of the most often cited examples of M-cubed in the modern day, because honestly, I don't find their lyrics befitting of the description. For our purposes, we'll look at a couple of songs by different acts rather than just one, as I believe it gives a better picture of the way the trope has been applied across a variety of different but connected styles in the present day. Hot Mulligan's If You Hadn't Spun Out in Your Oldsmobile, This Never Would Have Happened features both a classic emo title, but also a verse that reads, pretty standard fare for us at this point. A jaded guy goes out of his way to put down the subject of his affection with backhanded compliments, while simultaneously painting the narrator as the only person who actually supports her. Pretty typical of mild gaslighting behavior. It's a one-off in their broader catalog though, as I could conjure up no other examples of this theme popping up across their subsequent two albums. Minnesota-based math rock outfit Tiny Moving Parts is fronted by Dylan Matheson, a writer who makes liberal use of his previously established trope of putting himself down and making himself appear pathetic in an attempt to garner the sympathy and affection of the person he's pursuing. From Birdhouse. At the very least, he approaches it with an innocent enough lens that it reads more as a kid grasping at straws and trying anything that might work, rather than a malicious actor who has calculated the way to get what he wants, at least in my reading of it, but that doesn't absolve him of his responsibility, as this kind of lyricism can enable the bad behavior of other kids to believe that his kind of manipulation works, or at very least, that trying it is acceptable. While the line between Juice WRLD and Taking Back Sunday is anything but clear, when it comes to sonic characteristics anyway, it's widely accepted that Juice WRLD was heavily influenced by that era of emo releases, which is painfully clear in the way his lyrics use each one of the tropes we've laid out so far. On Robbery, he plays the victim for sympathy, blaming his ex for exacerbating his drug addiction. Won't Let Go sees Juice explore the violent fantasies one might expect from The Used or early My Chemical Romance.
You can bury me with her, and if she died before, can me and carry me with her. No, if I died before, shorty dying a widow. Let's not right down that road. Forever's forever, eternally attached to her soul.
And Candles combines both.
My last girl left me so fucked up, it was a blackout. You jumped first. It's a long way to hell, I ain't really trying to leave this earth. Do your worst. I've come to the conclusion, you can't kill me if I kill you first. I've been through the ringer.
Juice is indicative of a broader trend in the nascent emo rap genre, taking these kind of violent and manipulative lyrics and marrying them with the 808-laden production of modern, mainstream trap music in the style that Kanye West had pioneered in years past with records like 808 and Heartbreak and My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. We'll leave it there, as that could be its own video in and of itself, and Kanye's impact on modern music culture and his lyrics have been absolutely dissected to death. Suffice it to say, there are acts like Nothing Nowhere and others who are continuing to carry the torch of this style even after those who popularized it, like Juice WRLD and Lil Peep, have passed on. It's important for me to stress that, with the exception of Rivers Cuomo's lyrics in Across the Sea, I wouldn't call any of these lyrics indefensible or grounds for deplatforming. Music is inherently about expression, and sometimes that takes the form of negative emotions, violent fantasies, and bad behavior that wouldn't be acceptable in broader society if acted upon. At the same time, it's very important for fans and critics to cast a critical eye on and keep in mind that not everyone can suss out what is acting and what isn't. While the themes and tropes that Taking Back Sunday employed in their early years didn't continue on, those songs have a shelf life of their own, one that grows and evolves alongside all of us. Rivers Cuomo had no idea that Pinkerton, a piece of art he himself found ugly, gross, and repulsive in the years after its release, would spawn a host of imitators, and one wonders if he would have made different decisions had he known that outcome was possible at the time. In fact, his aversion to this kind of expression across the rest of Weezer's output confirms my suspicion that he has no interest in branding himself the face of this movement, and rightfully so. The visceral reaction that we saw on TikTok and Twitter in the wake of the coining of the phrase male manipulator music showed just how real its impact can be, or rather, the kind of people it can attract. I'd argue that the music isn't causing people to act this way, but rather just brings together a group of people who are agreeable to acting that way in the first place. It is interesting to me, however, some of the bands who have had this label attached to them without anything evident in the music they've released to classify them as such. Mom Jeans, Modern Baseball, and Sorority Noise are all often tagged as modern M-Cubed acts, while lacking the lyrical themes and tropes we've previously established. Sorority Noise is the most baffling to me. A group known primarily for its songs tackling depression, addiction, and loss, their biggest tracks forgo anything close to manipulation, opting instead for pure, raw catharsis about the ills that have befallen the narrator across a clearly troubled life. Controversies notwithstanding. Mom Jeans are a carefree, loose rock band who primarily write juvenile songs about smoking weed and hanging out with friends, about as harmless as you can get, particularly in a genre whose calling cards are depression, anxiety, and other darker themes. And Modern Baseball could be construed as falling into self-deprecation as manipulation, but I don't believe the framing of their songs supports that reading, as the execution belies the author's intent, which is simply to tell a story of what has happened, rather than crafting a disingenuous narrative for his own personal gain. To an extent, it's subjective what someone does or doesn't perceive as being M-Cubed, but to brand bands whose fanbase can act a certain way irregardless of how the band brands themselves or expresses themselves is a bit unfair to the artists themselves. Except the Smiths. Morrissey had it coming. The modern music scene has actually mellowed significantly from the heyday of male manipulator music in the early 2000s. The groups most well known for perpetuating that style have either left it behind altogether or ceased to exist, and those still tapping the well of M-cubed tropes and themes are doing so in a less overt way on the whole, with a few notable exceptions, and are mostly confined to younger artists still working their way through their late teen years, a period of immense change and internal struggle that can cause them to lash out in ways that may not be indicative of intent so much as it is a coping mechanism or ignorance of the impact. Whether that's due to a lack of public appetite driven by a more conscious understanding of power dynamics, gaslighting, and abusive behavior, or simply the declining popularity of the genres that built themselves on an M-cubed framework remains to be seen. What's undeniable is the need to be cognizant of the messaging and framing in the music we listen to, not to police the art or the artist, but rather to have proper context to what it is others may be taking out of the music we are all writing and listening to. Music is, as I've said in my work before, an art form that is uniquely equipped to be used as catharsis for both creator and consumer. But there are healthy ways to exercise catharsis, and the style in which male manipulator music tends to do this are detrimental to everyone involved: the creator, the consumer, and anybody affected by the actions either group may take as a result.